Hello all, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com. I'm here today with a project update video for this 1/6 scale radio-controlled Armortek M4A4 Sherman tank. Since the last video update, a lot of progress has been made to the model's front bow hatch area, as well as having the top front portion of the deck permanently affixed to the model. We'll be going over these additions as well as modifications. Moving our way to the front hatch wells themselves, like I mentioned before, the M4A4 is that of an earlier pattern Sherman that featured the blistered hatch wells with the small hatches as opposed to the larger hatches that are found on the later war Shermans like the M4A3 and later production M4A1s. Like with most components that are related to the Sherman, there are several different variations and different types of the same part. This usually differs from tank to tank in both plant of production as well as time frame. The M4A4, which was manufactured exclusively by Chrysler, utilized two types of bow hatch wells. The first style was that of the very early and original design, which utilized a very low profile and featured a flip-up direct vision periscope, very similar to what is found on German tanks like the Tiger I and Panzer IV. This design was deemed to be a weakness in the armor and was quickly phased out by 1942. That design was replaced with this design here, which is known as the wide blister hatchwell. The wide blister hatchwell is what was featured on the M4A4 throughout the rest of its production run. It is this high or wide version blister that is featured here on the Armortek kit, and both the early M4A3 that was released by Armortek as well as their 5C Firefly release feature the same style front hatch blisters. The only difference is that on their earlier release, this area here, the entire component was made out of a single casted white metal component, while on their Firefly variant, it is made entirely out of CNC'd aluminum billet. As you can see, the CNC billet, it's very nice and solid, and it's a nice base to work with for adding any upgrades or detail modifications to the component. Overall, the hatch wells have their basic shape and scale to them, and that's accurate. However, I will be adding and modifying the piece to make them a little bit more detailed as opposed to the kit original counterpart. As a note, the kit also came with the bow hatches, which would simply just pin directly to the integral hinge that we have here. Rather than using the kit hatch, I will be replacing those with the resin hatches that I have on the EastCoastArmory.com product line. For me to do that, I will need to make some modifications to these wells, which will be done in the following scene. And here goes the front of the vehicle with the bodywork now concluded. The bodywork has been added to the front section here, as well as the bow hatch area. And here goes a close-up of the reworked bow hatch area. As you can see, it has been completely and thoroughly blended into the body panel, giving it the illusion that the component is actually one solid cast unit that has been welded together. For the bow hatch area, this was all done with sculpting epoxies as well as other bodywork techniques. The entire casted area has its cast texture replicated into the plate surfaces. On the top portion here of the hatch blister, we can see that the ECA hatch resin hinge has been fixed to the blister and via the bodywork has been fused with the rest of the detail on the casting. Because of that, it now looks like that the hinge is a perfect fit and will all blend in once the model is painted. In addition to sculpting in the hatch hinge and all the other parts, I had to also mill away this portion here of the hatch recess. Because of the larger size of the ECA hinge compared to the kit original hinge, I needed to make the clearance in that so the hatch would fit nice and flush with that of the blister. To do that, this was facilitated with the milling machine. In addition to milling out the hatch area, I also milled out the little recess area, which is found on these front blisters, for that of the spare backup periscope. The spare backup periscope itself will be a Resin ECA component that will be added to this area as the build progresses. One detail about these early steeper angled small hatch equipped Sherman tanks is that the front hatch area and the front hull area is actually a lot more complicated than a lot of people tend to think they are. The Sherman has the stigma of being a really easily produced vehicle, and that is true. It is simpler than, say, some of the German tanks. However, these early versions of the Sherman actually had a lot of welding and different components to them, which were actually streamlined and replaced with the later production batches. The way these earlier Shermans from Glasher's plate breaks down as follows. The two side sliver here, these two are made out of rolled steel and are smooth to the touch. The center portion, rectangle here, this entire plate here is not rolled steel but is actually cast. The purpose of making this entire plate here out of cast metal was because of the bow machine gun well here. Because of the bow 1919, the entire plate had to have been made out of cast steel as opposed to rolled steel. Now, on the simplified Shermans, it was one continuous plate, and the 1919 well was actually a plug which was welded into a hole which was cut into the steel plate. Another interesting feature about the front rectangular plate here was that the original Sherman design actually featured dual M1919 machine guns in this portion over here. The dual 1919 machine guns was a carryover design from the M3 Lee, which featured two bow machine guns in the front portion of the vehicle. Some of the very early pilot models of the M4 and even the M4A4 had the machine gun wells present, but once the design feature was dropped right after the pilot models were produced, the feature was still molded into several castings and had to have been plugged up at the factory, which is why on some M4A2s you will notice a big blister in this portion over here. This is also true for the M4A1, which also featured an integrally casted lump in the front section here, which would have been originally intended for the bow 1919s. Moving up from the machine gun well plate are the two bow hatches. The two bow hatch wells are also made out of cast steel, and this is because of the well that needs to be integrally casted into the unit. There would be a left and a right hand casting, and the two pieces were separate and then they were just welded together. Once the whole unit was welded, it was one complete setup. Now, as you can see, that's just this front portion of the vehicle here. That's not including the rest of the vehicle, which also had some different plates that needed to be welded together. So as you can see, on a whole, these early versions of the Sherman were actually very complicated. In addition, for cutting down on production time and resources, another reason why this version of the Sherman was replaced was because of complaints from the field of there being a shot trap and a weakness in the armor because of the way the blisters emerge from the hull. Many times you see M4s and Shermans with this type of hull design when in the field. You will notice that they added applicant armor to the front hatch areas. These would be two steel plates which would be fitted and welded to the front portion here and here, which would give a little bit of standoff armor and would give the driver and assistant driver a little bit more protection. I do have the standoff armor as a set listed on the EastCoastArmory.com product line. However, because this vehicle is being modeled as such an early version of this tank, the applicant armor will not be added to this model. The model's 1919 machine gun has also been fitted. Because this vehicle, the starter kit, was designed to be that of a British Firefly, the kit does not contain an M1919. The reason is that on the Firefly, once the Brits decided to change the 75mm with that of the 17-pounder, because of the longer shells required for the gun, the entire bow assistant driver area was no longer needed. They removed all of the equipment from this area of the vehicle and replaced it with ammo racks in order to feed the gun. After the bow 1919 was removed on the British vehicles, the hatch well area was removed, and in its place a large steel plug was welded to the vehicle to plug up the new hole that remains with the removal of the 1919. Like I mentioned in the model unboxing video, the kit comes with said plug in order to add it to the front portion here of the tank. However, since I had to backdate mine as an M4A4, the machine gun area had to have been refabricated. The area itself that you see here was fabricated when the hull was still in pieces, and I have that also mentioned in an earlier video. The rest of the exterior portion of the well has been built up with layers of bodywork and sculpted to match that of the real vehicle. As for the M1919 itself, this here is an aftermarket set from panzerwork.com. The set is very detailed and is highly recommended. The set contains 3 M1919s. The purpose of the set was that it's originally intended for replacement of the stock M1919s that are found on the 21st century 1/6 scale M5A1 Stuart. However, the machine gun ball is a stock US AFV component and can be used on any World War II tank of the era. The machine gun itself is actually controlled via servo and can pivot on demand. Moving our way to the tank's upper deck, the Armortek M4A4 5C Firefly Sherman utilizes the deck and broken up into two main pieces. You have the top pan for the front half, and then the back half here is facilitated by another large pan, and it's all bolt together assembly like the rest of the vehicle. The two plates are fabricated out of aluminum and are pre-bent and pre-cut with all of their mounting holes for the various equipment that gets mounted on the two panels. This version here of the Armortek Sherman is more improved than that of their first 2005 M4A4 release. On that version of the Sherman, the entire top deck was comprised out of one pressed piece of 1/8" sheet metal. It was sheet steel, to be more specific. The sheet steel, even though it was one piece, did not have this intricate triangle bend that is found on all Sherman tanks. Instead of the piece being integral to the plate, the triangle was actually a separate little component that needed to be affixed to the plate. To do this, some people would drill holes into the plates and have fasteners and straps affixed to them, in which you would then bolt the entire triangle on with countersunk fasteners. Or if you had the capabilities to, you would have to have the two plates carefully welded together, either with a welder or if you were able to do the procedure yourself. To assemble the top deck, you need to do it in layers. Because of the way the hatch wells affixed to the top plate, you need to first attach the weld to the top deck, and then the whole unit then gets bolted to the tank's hull. Before I go ahead and do that procedure, I need to quickly turn my attention to that of the turret ring. Like all Armortek tanks, the turret actually sits on a very nicely machined brass bushing. The bushing is all one solid piece of brass and is finely machined to fit into the turret ring and mates perfectly with that of the turret itself. The turret spins very nice and smoothly on these brass bushings. One thing as of note though, when it comes to installing these rings, as you notice, the ring itself does not have any fastener mounting locations anywhere on it. It's just a smooth machined piece. Some people like to recommend to use adhesives or epoxies to glue the ring to the turret deck. I don't necessarily recommend that. Personally, I have always found it to be better and more permanent to affix these two pieces together with that of countersunk fasteners. To do that, I first need to mark the locations of where the ring orientates that on the deck. I went ahead with a Sharpie and drew a little line, thus making the lineup a lot easier. Once the lines have been drawn, I go ahead and mark the 4 locations on the brass ring with the Sharpie. After this scene, I'm going to go ahead and drill out these locations here on the drill press and add the countersinks with them as well. Once the countersinks are done, I will also drill matching holes into the top deck. Once the top deck has its holes drilled in for the bushing, I will then be able to progress on the actual installation of the 2 hatch wells, and also that of the turret turning gearbox, which gets mounted in the center portion here of the turret, or of the upper deck. For the tank's turret rotation, that's facilitated by the turret rotation motor that we see here. This is the stock Armortek turret rotation kit, and it comes with their option pack that contains the main drive as well as the gun elevation. To facilitate the turret turner, the kit supplies you with a geared motor, a motor mount, as well as a main drive gear. As for the motor, it's all plug and play. It's got a pre-connected jack, and this mates with a jack that's found on the tank's power supply. The motor gear and the motor mount, the mount itself is made out of CNC'd aluminum and is very nicely done. The gear itself is machined out of steel and has a brass bushing on the inside. As for the motor, there's a nice flat that's pre-milled into the shaft, which when fitted to the motor itself, fitted to the gear itself, will give a nice grip point for the screw to grab onto the shaft and prevent it from slipping. This system is standard on all Armortek tanks and work very well once assembled properly. And here's the unit fully assembled. Like I mentioned before, the unit assembles very simply. All the holes line up and was assembled in a matter of a minute. If we notice, the bracket went ahead and primed with some primer gray, as opposed to just leaving it with its bare aluminum finish. Also, if we notice the turret turner gear, it's mounted on. When you mount on these turret turner gears, make sure it mounts on nice and flush with that of the bracket like you see here. Now, one important thing that I didn't notice on this motor mount is if we could see the 2 mounting holes that are pre-drilled into the plate line up perfectly with that of the upper deck. One issue, though, is that if we notice the one hole here is really close up against the motor. So much so that a standard hex, when you put on the fasteners, the nut will not be able to reach the screw because of the motor. What I did was, instead of panicking and trying to drill another hole, I simply took one of the nuts and I ground off a good portion of it on the bench grinder. I held the unit with a vice grip, and while it was gripped in, I went ahead and ground off a nice portion of it. If we notice, there's still enough material left that the structural integrity of the nut is not compromised. However, it's just enough material to clear the motor when I mount on the fastener, like you see here. Because this will actually help with the model in the long run, in that because it's wedged up against the motor, the fastener will not tend to loosen up or unscrew on you while the model's in motion. However, having said that, Loctite is going to be used on all the fasteners, just like Loctite was also used on all the fasteners that you see here just to assemble the unit. One thing I noticed while I was painting the upper deck is something that, in case other people are building the same kit, should keep aware of. That is, of the bullet splash rim that gets bolted to the top deck, the front portion here, because of the turret turner motor mount, needs to be nice and flush. So the kit is designed with a countersunk fastener that secures the bullet rim to the top deck. The fastener does a great job and it keeps it nice and secure. However, one thing to keep of note is that sometimes with these countersunk fasteners, that even though they are countersunk, sometimes they are not necessarily flush once you bolt the component on to the tank. If we notice, there's a small little off-center little ledge from the countersunk fastener itself. Now, it's important that this piece stays absolutely flush, because when it comes time to mount on the turret turning mount, the mount needs to be completely square with the top deck in order for the turret turner gear to mesh properly with the mating gear that's on the turret itself. As we can see, as I put the mount on, there's some play and wobble to it because it's resting on this uneven surface. Before I continue any further, it's a simple fix. I'm going to hit the little fastener over here with a Dremel with a cutting stone and buff it away till it's nice and smooth. Once the procedure is complete, it looks something like this. And here's the same fastener that has just been hit with the Dremel, thus making it nice and flush with the top deck. As you can see, the fastener itself is still nice and secured to the top deck. However, it's a nice flat surface for mounting of the motor bracket. There is no wobble or play that can affect the function of this important component now that the piece is now ground flush. After the motor is installed, it is then time to install the ring. Now, if we can notice, before I went ahead and installed the motor mount, the top deck, the entire panel was primed with its primer gray. Also, after the primer was dry, I went ahead with a paintbrush and I painted the area around the turret with that of the base coat. Purpose of this is because once the turret is fitted, you're not going to be able to get into this area all that much. So it's good to pre-paint the area now before the turret gets installed. Once the base coat is dry, it is then time to install the brass ring. Now, one thing to note on these Armortek Shermans is because where the motor is mounted, and this is true for both the Firefly as well as the M4A4, the turret turner gear is really close up against the top deck. Because of that, let me just zoom in. Because of the close proximity of the turret gear, the ring, if once trying to be installed, is going to make contact with the gear and is not going to install properly, if at all. To remedy this, I went ahead and marked a little section of the ring where it mounts to the tank, and this little section here, I removed a little portion of the brass. The portion was simply removed with a Dremel, and then it was just sanded and polished nice and smooth to avoid any burrs or any other foreign objects that could hinder the turret's turning performance. With the little section removed, the ring simply gets inserted into the location nice and flush. As we can see, the ring seats nice and flushly to that of the top deck and has plenty of clearance for the turret turner gear to perform its function. And now the brass ring has been fitted. In addition to using the countersunk fasteners on the reverse side to make sure it's nice and flush, the fasteners are secured with a nut as well as a lock washer, and to keep everything together, a small drop of Loctite. With all these bolts now affixed, the top deck is now ready to be fitted to the vehicle. And here's the front deck of the model now fixed. The top deck is all bolted to the side of the model, and the top deck cannot come off. If I need to get on the inside, there is ample access with the turret removed. In addition to having the lights activation, I also have the turret turner motor wired and connected to the model circuitry. Also, as of note, I had to make a modification to one of the equipment that was stowed on the inside of the vehicle. If we recall from an earlier video, the amplifier module was originally mounted horizontally on an internal shelf in this area here. However, because of the motor for the transverse of the turret, it was making contact with the amplifier unit, and I was unable to mount the top deck to the hull. Because of this, I had to change the design slightly and move the amplifier module from being mounted horizontal to being mounted vertical that runs parallel with the model side hull. Because of this, it now gives me ample amount of room for the turret turner as well as any other type of equipment I need to affix to the vehicle. Moving on from the casted hull area, we'll now go into some of the other bow fittings that have been fitted to the vehicle. These would include the functional headlights, headlight posts, grab handles, as well as the auxiliary bow mounted radio stub. With the exception of the bow headlight mounts that you see here, the rest of these components are listed on the EastCoastArmory.com product line. Moving our way to the hull antenna mount, the early style versions of the Sherman are unique in that they have a antenna base mount that's added to the front glacis plate. The purpose of this mount is in case the vehicle to have a radio mounted inside of the hull compartment here. The antenna would emerge from this portion here of the hull. I have seen several vehicles with the antenna mounted in this location here. However, by and large, most of the time on these Shermans, the radio would be mounted in the bustle portion of the rear portion of the turret. On the early versions of the Sherman, the actual antenna mount itself was a casted steel blister. This blister was then welded to the front glacis plate. The blister itself on this model is a new addition to the EastCoastArmory.com product line and is a kit. The kit contains the blister with its cast texture that's molded in, along with a plastic disc and 4 brass fasteners for mounting on the top. The reason why the disc is separate from the mount itself is in case you would like to model the vehicle with a hull-mounted radio with the antenna emerging from this location here. Even though most of the time the radio would not be fitted in this location here, this design feature did carry over into the later hull M4A4 Sherman tanks with the simplified front glacis plate. If you ever look at a later production Sherman, you will notice that this plate with the 4 fasteners is located on the top deck, which would be right beside that of the assistant driver's hatch. The headlights themselves are mounted to the vehicle with the aid of the headlight mount. The headlight mount that you see here is actually a modified M10 tank destroyer armor mounting nub. The nub itself was modified to replicate that of the casted early style Sherman headlight post mount. On these Shermans, especially the earlier production units, the headlight post was by and large a casted little mount like we see here, which would then be welded to the front deck. When the front slope angle was changed on the later production units, this version of the plug was replaced with that of a different design. In addition to having the headlights fixed to the model, all of their wiring and circuitry has been completed. This model does feature remotely controlled lights. In addition to the headlights, this model will also be receiving taillights, which will be connected to the same circuit. Taillights will be affixed as the build progresses. However, one feature that I did build into this model is that because the channel that I'm using for the headlight operation is going to be also shared with that of another upcoming feature, I needed to design a cutoff switch in order to have the lights stay on even though I might be using the switch for another activity. To do this, I mounted on a cutoff switch in which the switch cuts off power to the model servo. As we notice, the lights are in the on position right now, and no matter how much I activate the radio, the circuit will not trip to turn off the lights. This not only works for when the lights are on, but also when the lights are off. As you can see, I turned off the lights, I hit the cutoff switch again, and there's absolutely no circuitry going into the headlight operation. And here's the light control module. For the module, it consists of a servo and an impact switch, as well as a wire harness. Once the servo makes contact with the switch, the lights activate. Because of the contact module here, I can go ahead and wire more lights to the system as I deem fit. And that concludes this project update video for this 1/6 scale radio-controlled Armortek M4A4 Sherman tank. If you like this video, stop by and like us on Facebook, and don't forget to check out eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 scale tank builds, as well as other 1/6 scale detail components. Thank you.